Okay, welcome to another random social distancing tutorial. This is going to be focused on the Elektron Digitakt and how to use it alongside Ableton Live to get some interesting applications to pull up samples. We're going to focus on the MIDI channels here for this tutorial, and this was brought about because I wanted to access many more samples than I could from the 8 audio tracks that are on the Digitakt by default. So right now I've got some samples loaded in here. And you can do some additional mapping using trig conditions to get other samples on these keys. But for the most part, these keys remain really just inactive unless you're using them with a MIDI device, or if you use a loopback utility or cable to get these commands back into the Digitakt. So there are some tutorials out there that cover that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to interface with Ableton Live and have some fun with that. So we're going to get to that in the next section of the video. Okay, to get started with this technique, we're going to need to start with some MIDI mapping of the 8 pads here that represent our MIDI instruments. And we're going to take a look here at our roadmap for this project. We have 8 MIDI pads here, A through H. And what we want in the end is we want each of those pads to be assigned to a different trigger note on the Digitakt. So that's done under the trigger page. The MIDI channel for all of these pads is going to be channel 1, and that's going to be assigned on the source page. And then we're also going to, later on, we're going to do some special mapping of an alternative note for each one of these pads. But that's going to be done through a conditional trigger, and we're going to come back to that here in red. The other thing that I'm going to do for each of the pads is I'm going to set a CC value of 85, and that is also going to be tied to, on our filter page here, we have a dial that we can turn. So you'll see there's a dial turning there, and I've got, it's hard to see here, but that's CC 85. That's going to come in handy in Ableton later on. So just to get a quick view of what this would look like as you're setting it up, here I'm just showing I've got each one of the MIDI pads set to channel 1 as far as our MIDI channels go. Then we're going back to show each of the notes that I have assigned on the trigger page to each one of these different pads. And that gets us everything we need as far as these pads go. Here's the CC 85, just showing that for each of these pads. And again, that's found if you click the amp button, that takes you to the CC page. And then if we look at the filter, we push the filter button, that takes you to this other page that shows you these dials. And those can be mapped to a number of different things. I'm going to jump into just another screen here to show you a way that I'm doing those alternate notes, but we're also going to come back to this later. These are conditional trigs that are set for specific triggers on specific tracks for different things that I want to happen, sometimes as a fill, but this is where I'm setting the alternative notes, and this is where I'm going to get some extra effects later on. But we're going to come back to that because I know that's a bit more down in the weeds, so more to come. Okay, things are going to get a little bit more interesting here as we take our MIDI mapping over into the Ableton side and get things working together. So what I have here is an Ableton project with a number of tracks. I've got 8 tracks so that they match up with our pads on the Digitakt, and I've loaded some royalty-free samples into each one of these. And I also have a MIDI device over here that we're going to use for the alternate notes that we assigned. And we want to be able to do two things. We want to be able to play the samples.
I'd like to go backstage.
Which means making this clip playable. But we also want to be able to scroll through the scene so that we can get to different clips.
The band's got to be in shape in a week or the contractors can't. The band's got to be in shape in a week or the contractors can't.
Okay, so looks like that one's looped. I don't want that to loop. So we're going to make sure all of these are just set to one shot. Okay, let's make sure that. For this purpose, we're not going to warp anything. We're going to turn that all off. Now, I have a couple things I want to do. I want to be able to play this track, but I also want to scroll through. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go into my MIDI mapping mode, which is the upper right-hand corner here, the MIDI button. That turns us into our purple MIDI mapping mode here. And I want to map the buttons that are right here in the middle of the screen. Right now you'll see they're already mapped to C3, D3, E3. And I'm going to remove one of those to show how I did it. So over on my Digitakt, I've got my track A set up for my MIDI. And when I hit this, it mapped my note for C3 over into the Ableton screen here. So now that's mapped again. The note that you're going to need to map, or the CC value, I should say, that you're going to need to map for scrolling is going to use this icon over here. And if I delete the mapping on that button, I can add that mapping back by going to my filter page on any of my mapped tracks here and just turning that dial, and I get my CC85. That just happened to be what I chose. That could be anything as long as you're not using the value for anything else. So that is all of the mapping that's actually going to be done here. 8 buttons and one special button over here for the master track. So now we're going to come back with a demonstration first of what we're doing here, and then some further explanation of how it's working, and then also we're going to see how to use this MIDI device here with the alternate notes. Okay, this is where things are going to get a little more interesting as we put everything together. So we're going to start with a demo of the basic MIDI playback of samples using just Ableton. Now keep in mind the Digitakt right now is completely turned down, so none of the sounds that you're going to hear are coming from the Digitakt itself. The Digitakt is controlling Ableton, and everything you're going to hear is coming from Ableton. So let's just listen to this briefly. Okay, so what was happening there? We had every sample that was in this first row had an opportunity to play based on a pattern that I had programmed on the Digitakt. And if I want to move into another row of samples, that's where I would use my, go to my filter page and use the dial for the CC value that I set. And that's going to change the row that I'm actually pulling samples from. So if we play that same pattern again.
What time is it? What time is it?
Okay, so that's a way for us to access almost unlimited samples from the Digitakt using Ableton, and with the additional capabilities of using some other MIDI as well, which is going to be the next little clip that we're going to go into. Okay, this is where things get strange. So far we've been using the Digitakt to map, to play back some audio samples across these scenes. We can also simultaneously use some MIDI commands to also kick off some MIDI instruments. So what I've got here is a impulse drum machine in purple here along the right-hand side. And I'm just going to play a little bit of this, and you'll notice I'm going to be hitting the fill button on the Digitakt, because that's when these sounds are going to be engaged as conditional triggers. Now keep in mind, everything that's playing here is coming from Ableton. None of the sounds are coming from the Digitakt.
There was someone lower on the scale of human beings. You could be sensitive to that.
So let's take a look at how that was done. Now, the rest of this video is going to assume that you have some understanding of trig conditions or trigger conditions in the Digitakt world. And this is just a way to add variance to different events within your sequence, whether they're audio events or MIDI events from the different pads here. And basically, you'll go into trigger mode and hold down a trigger, and then you have a variety of changes you can make on the screen here. Now, just to see some of those changes I made, I'm going to do a close-up here. These are some triggers that I've changed to play different notes and also to be active only when the fill button is being pressed on the Digitakt. Now, in order to understand this further, we need to bring up this mapping image again. And we saw earlier that the notes here in blue from C5 to C6, that's what we were using for these pads to get our initial sample playback off of Ableton. And all of those buttons and all those notes are already mapped, so we can't really use those now. What we've got to do is we've got to jump up outside of this range so that we don't have anything overlapping. And I just chose 2 octaves up, so now we're C7 through C8. And what I'm doing with that is I'm using the one of the MIDI channels here, or MIDI tracks rather, to install a drum machine plugin. This is just a stock impulse drum set. And normally, if I tried to play this with these notes that we're using now, I wouldn't get the same result. I would actually get a train wreck. So what I've got to do is I've got to use a little trickery on the pitch side here with a MIDI effect to take the incoming MIDI, pitch it down 2 octaves or 24 semitones, and that brings it back in the range of the notes that this is looking for to play these parts properly. So now I can have everything playing at once on the audio side. When I hold down my fill button, I'm getting the notes that are coming from that instrument here. So let me solo that track so that we can just hear that instrument. Wideness, so we got everything. So this is all coming from this instrument here. Pretty cool, huh? So it's a lot to set up, definitely takes some time, and is really, I think, an intellectual challenge at any rate, to try it and see if you could pull it off, and then see how you could use it creatively, at least in the studio. It might not be something you'd want to do live. If you are using a Digitakt, you're probably trying to get away from the computer anyway, but if you're stuck inside with tons of equipment and time during this crazy time of the year, yeah, it's something you might end up doing and having a lot of fun with. So thanks for watching. All right, this part of the video requires a bit of caffeine, so if you have any coffee or tea, cheers. Some people may need something stronger. This is going to explain a little discrepancy that you may have noticed earlier in the video when I did the mapping in Ableton. Now, the Digitakt default range, starting with C5 MIDI note, actually becomes a C3 when we go into a piece of software on a computer. And it's not specific to Ableton, and I'm going to show that here. So when we're looking at a MIDI capture tool on the top of our screen here, and I just play a little bit of my sequence, we can see that my notes that are mapped as C5 on the Digitakt are coming in as C3. And that's just a quirk of the Elektron line. It's actually pretty common among the industry manufacturers. I did double check the Elektronaut site to confirm this. And different manufacturers might select different ranges as their default ranges, but you can always remap it on a computer. So this presented some challenges, and when I looked at the conditional trigs, I had those mapped as C7, and of course they're going to change. They're going to become the C5 range. So if I play my conditional trigs now, we'll see. Now you're not going to hear anything because we're just looking at MIDI. We can see our C5 range is playing there. So that's a deeper look at the changes there happening behind the scenes. So if we look at my chart here, just to summarize what's happening, we have all of our MIDI tracks A through H. We have the initial note on the Digitakt, which is the C5 range of notes up to C6. Because of this mapping, just native mapping change, it's going to become C3 through C4. And I've already got that mapped in Ableton, and those notes are being used. So those notes are reserved. For my alternate notes on the conditional trigs, I've started those in the C7 range all the way up to C8. Because of the native mapping change that's going to happen, they're going to be 24 semitones less, so they're going to go from C5 to C6. And because I don't want to use that range, I didn't want that range to be confused with anything, and I also needed to get the range back to C3 that the impulse drum machine wanted to see. I went through and I just did the 24 semitone pitch down to take us back down to C3 so that the impulse drum machine can work. And then we have our selector for moving through our scenes mapped to controller 85, and you can see that here on the top of the screen. Controller 85 is getting a different value. And the nice thing about having this mapped on each one of these pads, no matter what MIDI track I'm playing, I can still change the scene regardless of where I am. So yeah, this was an interesting exercise. If you enjoyed this, let me know, and I'll put some other notes up if I think of anything else. But this was everything else I can think of, and I'm glad I went back to take a look at this. So hopefully this will answer some questions, and have a good day.